was born in Sri Lanka. Both of my parents were born and grew up here. And in my first year of life here, Sri Lanka had been going through a lot of civil and political unrest. So when I was just a few months old, there were either government sanctioned or certainly government enabled paramilitary gangs that were going around various parts of Colombo and other parts of Sri Lanka as well. My parents had gotten word that they were potentially at risk and in danger. But before they had a chance to grab our things and to get away from our home, one of these gangs showed up. And so my dad grabbed me and ran into the bathroom at the back of the house, while my mum was kind of stuck in the front of the house when this gang busted down the door and came in. And being very unhelpful as a 1-year-old, less than a 1-year-old at that time, I started crying. And they heard me crying, my dad was holding me, and all that he and my mum could do at that moment was just to pray. There was a bunch of these guys, they were under the influence of drugs, they had all kinds of equipment, and they were banging away at this door, this raggedy old wooden bathroom door with this tiny little latch. And all the principles and laws of physics would suggest that there's no way this latch should have held out, but they just banged away and it just held. They ended up giving up and leaving. As they were leaving, they kind of yelled, "We're going to come back, we're going to burn down the house." So my mum and dad grabbed me and a nappy bag, and that's all we managed to take, and ran into the bushes at the side. And there was a servant girl from nearby, and she came and kind of pointed to the reality for my parents that they were unlikely to survive the night. And she said, "Look, it's likely you're going to be killed tonight. At least give us your baby and we can find a home for him. We'll give him another chance. We'll make sure he gets raised and protected." And so my parents somehow mustered the courage and gave me to this girl, and they thought that's the last that they would ever see me. And they spent that night huddled in those bushes for the most part. They saw their house burnt down to the ground, everything they owned, all of their valuables. But somehow the Lord protected all three of us that night, and my parents survived, and they managed to take shelter in another home. The next day, my uncle, who's a police officer and is fluent in Sinhala, which is the majority language of Sri Lanka, he managed to go and, again, by the grace of God, find me and bring me back. I got returned to my parents and reunited with them, and the next thing we knew, we were on an open cargo ship on its way up to Jaffna in the north of Sri Lanka. So it wasn't until some time after that that we got this confirmation that we were being given refugee status in Australia. And then soon after that, the Lord led us to Australia and gave us a new beginning. When I look back on that, it just became so clear to me that the Lord's fingerprints were just all over us right from the beginning. There's no way that that lock should have held. There's no way that my dad and I, at least, should have got out of that situation alive. The people and the friendships that I was able to form, the educational opportunities to study law, to get admitted to the bar, to work in politics, to work with prime ministers and ministers, to literally sit around the Australian cabinet table of the national government of Australia in the national parliament. Clearly what people had intended for evil, he had meant and used for good. But there was this one gap emotionally and spiritually that I was struggling with, and it was reconciliation and forgiveness. And one of the real sources of that struggle was I just couldn't understand how a people, how a government, how the men that attacked my family and tried to kill my father and I, how they could bear that kind of hatred and evil and darkness. And it wasn't until the Lord showed me that I didn't have to look very far to understand that darkness and that malice. I only had to look inside my own heart, and there were very clear, though very embarrassing traces of that darkness in myself. I used to think that it was about good fighting the evil out there, but what the Lord showed me as I went through this journey is that that fight between good and evil is real, but it's inside every human heart. It's not an us versus them thing. And that's when it really dawned on me that as far as God is concerned and as far as His perfection would have it, my dad and I might as well have been on the other side of the door with those men who were attacking us. We were all just a bunch of people that are broken, that need the saving and transforming love of Jesus Christ that can only be delivered through His cross and through His forgiveness. The power and beauty of the cross is that it offers reconciliation and restoration, but it doesn't negate injustice. The Christian message is very clear that we are called to loosen the chains of injustice, to fight against it, to fight for the dignity of people. And so that fight goes on. But the call for justice comes from a place of love, of compassion, of wanting to see restoration and dignity restored, not from a place of bitterness and anger. So having that revelation from the Lord, to be able to then come back here in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, 1,500 meters from where I was born. And as I walked up onto the stage, the Lord was very, very clear with me. And he said to me, did you know that it was almost exactly 35 years ago since I took you and your family out of this country? And when I did, your father was exactly the age that you are now. Your mother was exactly the age that your wife is now. And you were exactly the age that your son, Zach, is now. See how I work. See how I bring these things together. I'm not just a God of symmetry. I'm a God of purpose. I'm a God of redemption. And I'm a God of vision for what I always knew I had for you in your life. And it was really at that moment that God brought it all together for me. And the words of Joseph from the Old Testament just rung in my ears as I started that talk, that what men had meant for evil, that God had meant and used for good.